A week before Election Day, we're getting a fresh look at how the race in Nevada is shaping up between the top Democratic contenders for the White House. A poll released Friday by the Las Vegas Review-Journal and AARP Nevada reports Bernie Sanders is leading the state, as you see there. He currently has support from 25% of likely Democratic caucus goers, while Vice President Joe Biden comes in second, some 7 points behind the Vermont senator. Nevada will hold its nominating contest on February 22nd, followed by South Carolina a week after that. For more on this, let's bring in CBS News Campaign 2020 reporters Cara, Korte and LaCrai Mitchell, doing some fantastic work in the field these past few months. The first few questions, Cara, I want to throw at you because yesterday was Sanders' first big day back on the campaign trail after that win in New Hampshire. But I get the sense that the Democratic establishment, if you can kind of characterize it, isn't so excited at Biden winning. I'm just wondering, how is the campaign feeling as they head into the next few contests?
Well, Errol, you get that sense, and I think the Sanders campaign gets that sense as well. It's something that we hear the senator talk about on the trail now almost every day. He talks about his opponents. He talks about Republicans, President Trump, the healthcare industry, the fossil fuel industry, people that they're going to go up against. And he also names the Democratic establishment. And Errol, sometimes that line on the Democratic establishment brings some of the largest applauses of any applause line in a Sanders stump speech. So when we hear these reports coming from maybe President Barack Obama or Secretary Hillary Clinton, other flacks that have worked for Democrats across the years, saying that Sanders represents a narrow base, and he wouldn't be able to galvanize all Democrats, especially moderate Democrats. The Sanders campaign embraces that, and we hear, as I just said, we hear it from the senator himself. They believe that they're building a coalition, a grassroots movement of young people, of working people, of people of color, and essentially they think once we do that, once we win these primaries, stack up some victories, everyone else will come along. So if you get that sense, your nose is right on.
Yeah.
You're sensing exactly what's happening.
Now, what about the Vermont senator's approach when it comes to criticizing some of his Democratic opponents? It appears as if he stopped naming rivals like Pete Buttigieg and Mike Bloomberg, who is taking up a lot of the oxygen at the moment. Is that accurate, and why is the campaign taking that direction?
That's right, Errol. And as I was with the senator in the build-up to the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary, he was much more vocal than we had seen him before, specifically naming people like Mayor Buttigieg and Mayor Bloomberg, saying that Mayor Bloomberg is buying the election because he's a billionaire, saying that Mayor Pete is funded by these billionaires. Senator Sanders contrasts that with his own grassroots fundraising. What we've seen now is perhaps things cooling off a little bit, right? Is that we were at the height of something moving into the New Hampshire primary when Sanders was naming Buttigieg on a daily basis. And now he's just backed away from that. Yesterday he was campaigning in North Carolina and Texas, and I was with him, and he was mentioning campaign fundraising and making distinctions between the way that he does it and others do it, but he was not naming these candidates. Now, what is interesting and what is now a pattern we've seen with the Sanders campaign is even though the senator may not be naming opponents, people around him are. Senator Nina Turner is one of Senator Sanders' national campaign co-chairs. She often travels with him or around the country without him campaigning for the senator, and she said yesterday that Mayor Bloomberg was simply apologizing for some of his record as mayor of New York, whether with stop and frisk or redlining. According to Senator Turner, Mayor Bloomberg was only apologizing in order to win the presidency, that it wasn't an authentic apology. And she said of black people that we are not for sale. It was really, really strong rhetoric in Charlotte, North Carolina. It was a very diverse crowd, and they were eating it up. So we see this contrast sometimes between Senator Sanders and his surrogates, and we're going to continue to see that kind of beat march on. They are not happy with the way that Bloomberg is being treated by the media and the DNC, so they're going to continue to draw that distinction.
Yeah, and well done speaking through that drone flying over your head. Appreciate that. Mayor Bloomberg, though, would counter and say, you know, he's funding his own campaign, and so he is not beholden to anybody, a common defense he keeps making. But just before we switch over to South Carolina, Cara, I want to ask you about the criticism Sanders faces that he can't pull a Democratic coalition or the party in general together should he be the nominee. What is the Sanders coalition, and how is the campaign responding to that narrative?
Well, Errol, they zero in on voters that have never voted before. We've seen this growing now for a while, right? This narrative amongst the Democratic Party is what defines us? Are we the party of working people? Are we the party of minorities? Obviously, people that are in power would say we're the party of all of those things. But we see Senator Sanders zeroing in on people that have never voted before. We see a lot of his campaign events in smaller towns that are largely minority or not wealthy areas in certain states. So we're going to continue to see him focus on that. An example of this, Errol, just last week in New Hampshire, Senator Sanders was at a forum for reproductive rights, and he was asked, is there room in the Democratic Party for pro-life Democrats? And he very simply said no. If you are a Democrat, that means that you need to be pro-choice. So that's kind of can show you how Sanders and his campaign are trying to steer the Democratic Party into what some consider to be far left, they consider to be dead on.
And you look, Senator Sanders admits he's not warm and fuzzy. He doesn't like wishing people happy birthday, but he says he understands that's a criticism and he wants to work on that. So just something to consider. I do want to now pivot to South Carolina. LaCrai, Senator Amy Klobuchar saw a surge in support in the New Hampshire primaries. I'm wondering if you're seeing any momentum or that having an impact in South Carolina, since she too has been criticized for not having a more diverse base of Democratic support.
Well, I'll tell you, Errol, I spoke to some voters last week at an event, and one person of all the voters I spoke with mentioned Senator Klobuchar's name, and this was following the New Hampshire primary. And look, she hasn't had as many people on the ground throughout this cycle here. To date, when I spoke with the campaign last week, they said less than 10 paid staffers are on the ground here. And so now I think what they've been banking on is that sort of momentum push, that momentum push coming out of those first two early states. They're hoping to be able to expand their organization on the ground here and bring some of those folks from those early states to South Carolina, because their thought is that if voters know who she is here, that they will like her. And so they're hoping to be able to get here and knock doors. But I will tell you, that's going to be an uphill battle for them, because there are teams that have been here since last May. They've got bigger organizations, more paid staffers, and they've got advertisements. So I think that Senator Klobuchar is going to have a time trying to put together a coalition and a squad here in these couple of weeks when other teams have been here for so long. And so we'll see how that manifests for her. But for now, I think she has little name recognition. And throughout this cycle in state polls here, she's registered low, if at all.
Yeah, I mean, she is kind of the little engine that could, and the senator says, look, the more people that hear about her and her policies and that she can beat, and has, I think, won every election she's run in, and she's beaten Republican opponents, and every one of her Republican opponents has left politics after she's done so. She says people will be impressed, but it is, as you say, an uphill battle. I want to ask you about endorsements, because Pete Buttigieg's team in South Carolina announced such an endorsement from State Representative J.A. Moore earlier this week. How significant is that for the former mayor, considering he too needs to show that support from a more diverse base?
I think a lot of people would say it's really significant for him, Errol. It was arguably the most prominent endorsement that he's received in the state to date. Representative Moore was an ardent Kamala Harris backer when she was still in this race, but he's one of those endorsements that's going to work for the mayor. And in South Carolina, it's all about relationships. And so when you have someone like J.A. Moore stepping out and saying, look at this guy, give him a second look, I think that's going to mean something for voters who may not have been looking at him before. And when I talked to Moore last week, he said his appeal to Buttigieg was that he's young, and he called him the truest representation of the millennial generation. He said he's a 37-year-old mayor from a small town that had the audacity to run for president. What's more millennial than that? And for more, and I think for others who are starting to learn more about Buttigieg, that's going to make a difference. His youth, he can bring a new excitement. That's what I've heard from some of his supporters here on the ground. And look, he's also been putting in some money in advertisement. Back in December, he aired his first TV ad. Since then, he's also aired ads that have featured Jim Clyburn's grandson, Walter Clyburn, who's on his team. He has been making sure that he's built these different coalitions, and he's doing these rural roundtables with local mayors. And so even though it hasn't necessarily resonated in the polls, because arguably it hasn't, he's still polled pretty low too. I think his team is hoping that with endorsements like Moore and with some of this grassroots effort that they're trying to mount on the ground in some of these rural places, that it'll make a difference in the next coming weeks.
Now, we are all these minutes into this conversation, and we have yet to even mention former Vice President Joe Biden, the perceived frontrunner in coming into these caucuses and primaries, his campaign not having the hoped results in Iowa or New Hampshire. How is the campaign recalibrating or readjusting? The former vice president saying definitively he will win South Carolina. So what is the plan now for the Biden campaign?
Well, I'll tell you, this team they've been saying from the very beginning that they haven't been taking any voters for granted. I think that message still reigns true, but I do think there is some additional pressure. You know, after not having such great showings in those first two early states, I think he's been able to tell voters, hey, those are different demographics. When I get to Nevada, when I get to South Carolina, we're going to turn the tables. And so now it's a matter of trying to do just that. And what his team on the ground has been saying is they've been bringing surrogates into town like they have from the very beginning. They have announced that there will be a bus tour coming up, and he's also already done a surrogate bus tour a little while back. The vice president himself is going to be in town the week ahead of the primary, and they're going to have 60 plus people on the ground that are going to be actively working for these votes and trying to assure people who have been supporting him from the beginning that they shouldn't be concerned. And I'll tell you, when I've spoken to supporters of his, they've said to me that they've known from the beginning that he might not do so well in Iowa and in New Hampshire. And I think that's because the campaign made a pointed effort from the very beginning to say that they were really counting on South Carolina. That's where they were confident that they would do best. And so I've heard that message echoed here from voters. And I also have heard people say, look, this is where it matters, because this is where you're going to see a majority minority Democratic electorate. And they say the Democratic nominee has to be someone who can resonate with this group. And so I think for his supporters, they're saying for now, they're okay with him not having done so well in those first two early states. But South Carolina is going to prove pivotal.
All right, from drones to police and fire sirens, our campaign reporters are real superstars. LaCrai Mitchell and Cara Korte, thank you both so much for joining us this Saturday.